Suez City stood at the end of the canal like a prize and a warning. By the 24th of October, 1973, Israeli armor had driven south on the West Bank, cut deep into the rear of the Egyptian Third Army, and reached the approaches to the city that gave the canal its name. After the desperate nights at Devasoir and the road battles around Chinese Farm, this seemed like the final movement of a campaign that had turned in Israel's favor. The tanks had crossed into Egypt, the Third Army was under pressure, and the map suggested that one more thrust might tighten the noose. But cities are not maps. Suez would show how quickly armored momentum, so powerful in open ground, could break apart in streets defended by determined men who knew the ground and had nowhere easy to go. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The road to Suez had begun with Egyptian success, not Israeli confidence. Egypt had crossed the canal on the 6th of October, shattered the Bar-Lev line, and forced Israel into painful learning under fire. Then came the failed Egyptian armored push of the 14th of October, the Israeli discovery of the Devasoir Gap, the countercrossing, and the southward drive that threatened the Third Army's lifelines. By the time Israeli forces neared Suez, the operational logic seemed clear. If the city could be seized, or at least dominated, Israel might complete the isolation of the Third Army and strengthen its hand as ceasefire diplomacy gathered force. Yet that logic contained a dangerous assumption. It treated Suez as another point on a line of advance, when in reality it was a dense human and physical battlefield that could devour a force designed for speed. The city mattered for reasons larger than its streets. Suez sat near the southern end of the canal, close to routes, ports, and supply connections vital to the Egyptian army in the southern sector. The Third Army, east of the canal, still held its bridgehead in Sinai, but its position was becoming increasingly precarious as Israeli forces threatened the roads and rear areas west of the water. Control of Suez could have deepened that pressure and given Israel a dramatic symbol of recovery after the shock of the war's opening. But symbolic objectives are dangerous when they encourage haste. A city may look like a final dot on the operational map, the place where an arrow ends neatly. For the soldiers entering it, that dot becomes intersections, balconies, stairwells, alleys, rooftops, courtyards, and windows. Israeli armored forces under Avraham Adan had been moving hard in the south, and their recent successes had restored confidence in maneuver. In open or semi-open ground, Israeli tanks could use speed, gunnery, radios, and aggressive command to strike Egyptian positions and disrupt rear systems. But urban combat changes the value of almost every armored strength. Lines of sight shorten, movement is channeled into streets. A tank can no longer choose distance in the same way. Infantry can hide above, beside, and behind it. A vehicle that is strong from the front can be vulnerable from upper stories, side streets, or close-range weapons fired from cover. Armor entering a city without enough infantry, reconnaissance, and caution is not entering a smaller battlefield. It is entering a battlefield with more directions than the crew can watch. The defenders of Suez were not an army waiting politely to be overrun. The city contained Egyptian soldiers, including regular troops and specialized forces, along with local militia and armed civilians who joined the fight in defense of the city. Some were cut off or disorganized by the larger Israeli advance, but that did not make them harmless. Urban defense often turns fragments into strength. A small group with anti-tank weapons, rifles, machine guns, or grenades can hold a building or cover an intersection. A defender who cannot maneuver across the desert may still know a side street, a doorway, or a firing position invisible to an attacker. The defense of Suez drew on military skill, local determination, and the powerful fact that men fighting in a city can make the attacker pay for every assumption of easy passage. The Israeli attack began under pressure from time as well as enemy fire. The United Nations ceasefire had already entered the war as more than a diplomatic phrase, but both sides were still fighting for position, advantage, and survival. This is a recurring truth of war. Ceasefires do not stop battles the instant they are announced. Commanders often try to improve their positions before the guns truly quiet, and that urgency can push forces into decisions they might otherwise reconsider. At Suez, the desire to finish the encirclement, exploit momentum, and impose facts before diplomacy froze the battlefield encouraged action. The tanks and armored columns moved toward a city whose defenses had not been fully understood. The operation carried the confidence of a successful advance, but not the careful preparation urban combat demands. Once inside the city, the Israeli force encountered a different war. Streets that looked passable became traps. Vehicles moved forward and then found themselves under fire from directions that were hard to identify. Egyptian defenders used buildings, corners, and close-range positions to attack vehicles and infantry. Some Israeli units became separated, confused, or pinned down. The sound of battle inside a city is different from the open desert. Echoes distort direction, smoke hangs between buildings, and the next threat may be above a tank rather than ahead of it. A crew trained to scan ridgelines and desert folds now had to worry about windows. Infantry riding with or near the armor faced fire at close quarters, where every doorway might matter. The momentum that had carried the advance south began to fracture, block by block. The fighting exposed the old problem of tanks and infantry in its harshest form. Tanks can bring shock, protection, and firepower into a city, but they cannot clear a city by themselves. Infantry must search buildings, secure flanks, protect vehicles from close assault, and identify threats the tank crews cannot see. Engineers may be needed to handle barricades, mines, obstacles, and routes through rubble. Artillery and air support, even when available, must be used carefully because cities contain civilians, friendly troops, and structures that can both hide defenders and trap attackers. At Suez, the balance was wrong for the task at hand. Israeli armor entered with insufficient understanding of the defense and insufficient control over the urban environment. The result was not a smooth seizure of a strategic point, but a bloody lesson in the limits of armored exploitation. For the Egyptian defenders, Suez became a moment of resilience at the end of a campaign that had turned painfully against them in the west. The Third Army was under threat, Israeli forces were behind the canal line, and the early triumph of Operation Badr had been complicated by encirclement and crisis. In that setting, the city's resistance mattered both militarily and psychologically. It denied Israel the easy final symbol of a campaign completed. It showed that Egyptian forces could still fight effectively, even under severe operational pressure. It also reminded both sides that a battlefield reversal does not erase an army's will. Egypt had been surprised by Israel's crossing, but in Suez, the defenders turned the city itself into a weapon and refused to make the last phase of the war simple. For the Israeli soldiers caught in the streets, the cost was immediate and personal. Vehicles were hit, men were killed or wounded, and units struggled to recover comrades under fire. Urban battle compresses fear, because distance disappears. A threat that would be visible for hundreds or thousands of yards in the desert may appear suddenly at the end of a street. A wounded man may lie only a short distance away and still be terribly hard to reach. Commanders trying to coordinate rescue, withdrawal, or renewed movement face the same problem as the crews. The city broke the fight into fragments. Accounts of the battle vary in detail, as they often do after confused close combat, but the broad truth is clear. Suez became a costly failure for the attacking Israeli force and a sobering end to its southern momentum. The battle's importance lies partly in its timing. Had Suez occurred earlier, before the Israeli crossing and the encirclement of the Third Army, it might have seemed like one urban action among many. Coming at the end of the counteroffensive, it carried a sharper meaning. Israel had recovered operationally with impressive speed and boldness, but recovery was not the same as unlimited mastery. The army that had forced the Deverswar crossing, fought through Chinese Farm, and driven south into Egypt could still be stopped when it entered the wrong kind of battle under the wrong conditions. Armored warfare had given Israel a way to reverse the campaign, but Suez showed that armored success can reach a boundary where terrain, preparation, and infantry resistance change the rules abruptly. Suez also complicates any simple victory story. Israel had achieved a remarkable operational reversal, crossing the canal and threatening the Third Army in a way that would shape the ceasefire negotiations. Egypt, however, had already achieved the political transformation Sadat wanted by crossing the canal, breaking the post-1967 deadlock, and proving that the situation could not remain frozen. The defense of Suez added another layer to that ambiguity. It did not undo Israel's encirclement pressure, but it denied Israel a clean final triumph in the city. It gave Egypt a symbol of defiance, even as its Third Army faced grave danger. The war was becoming something neither side could reduce to a simple battlefield verdict. Each had gained leverage, each had paid heavily, each had reason to remember the ending differently.
In the long history of armored warfare, Suez City stands as a warning that should sit beside the more famous lessons of open desert maneuver. Tanks can exploit breakthroughs, disrupt rear areas, and impose operational shock, but cities demand a different grammar. They reward preparation, infantry coordination, reconnaissance, engineers, patience, and respect for defenders hidden at close range. They punish forces that mistake momentum for control. From Cambrai onward, armored forces were imagined as a way to restore movement to battlefields frozen by firepower and trenches. At Suez, movement entered streets and was slowed by the oldest problems of urban war: visibility, concealment, fear, and men fighting from buildings. The tank remained powerful, but the city made it dependent again on the foot soldier beside it.
The failed attack on Suez did not change the whole outcome of the campaign by itself, but it shaped the ending's character. It checked Israeli momentum at the very moment when diplomacy and military pressure were converging around the fate of the Egyptian Third Army. It reminded commanders that a successful encirclement and a successful urban assault are not the same operation. It gave the season one final battlefield reversal before the story widened into ceasefire enforcement, superpower tension, and political settlement. Suez City was not the place where the Canal War began, and it was not the place where all its meaning was decided, but it was where armored confidence met walls, windows, defenders, and the hard truth that the last mile of a campaign can be the most unforgiving. The war had turned on crossings and roads. In Suez, it ended in streets.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.